Vamos a iniciar esta conferencia a cargo del profesor Martin O'Neill. Martin es profesor de filosofía política de la Universidad de York, en el Reino Unido. Voy a decir algunas palabras para presentar a Martin y su obra y la relevancia de su visita, y después voy a switch to English para darle la bienvenida a Martin y dejarle el espacio. Pero quiero decir brevemente algunas cosas sobre Martin porque es tan importante que esté con nosotros. Martin, como ya dije, es profesor de filosofía política en la Universidad de York, donde trabaja desde 2018. Martin tiene un pregrado en Politics, Economics and Philosophy en la Universidad de Oxford. Y tiene también un MPhil en filosofía en la Universidad de Oxford, y estudió su doctorado en Harvard con Tim Scanlon. Martin se ha dedicado, también trabajó con Scanlon con el parque. También se ha dedicado a trabajar en aspectos de lo que podríamos llamar filosofía política aplicada. De hecho, su exposición de ahora, la idea de la construcción comunitaria de riqueza, está en esa línea. Pero tiene una obra bastante importante en filosofía política, especialmente en concepciones de igualdad, libertad, responsabilidad y justicia social. Así que estamos muy contentos de que Martín pueda estar hoy día acá con nosotros. We'll switch to English now. Martin, thank you very much for being here. And we are very glad to have you here. So, please, everything is ready. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. So muchas gracias, Claudio. Es un gran placer estar aquí hoy. Solo lamento que mi charla sea en inglés, porque mi español es una lástima. Espero que la próxima vez que visite pueda intentar hablar en español, pero not this time, sorry. But thank you for your patience with me. So what I want to do today is really to give quite an applied talk in political philosophy about the idea of community wealth building, which is an approach that which is an approach, oh my gosh, that's very loud, which is an approach that my co-author Joe Guyman and I explore in this cheap and readily available book, The Case for Community Wealth Building. And it's an approach to thinking about economic development and economic policy at the local level that I think is gaining quite a lot of ground, certainly in parts of Europe and parts of North America, in Australia and elsewhere. I'm here really more to learn than to do anything else. So I'll be very interested to hear whether the kinds of ideas that I describe, whether they have an equivalent in Chile, and whether there's anything in the way either the local authorities in Chile are thinking about economic policy or city governments, whether it fits in with things that might be familiar here. But hopefully that will make more sense after I've introduced this idea. Oh, aha, I need to turn this clicker on. So I'm going to, oh, right, this clicker. Right, I might just do it on the laptop. Maybe it's just not selected. Aha, so the technology is too complicated. There's too many things going on here. So 4 parts to the talk. I'll introduce the idea of community wealth building. I'll talk a little bit about why this rather applied real world approach matters for political philosophy and for political philosophers. I'll then thirdly talk a little bit about the kind of normative basis for this kind of approach. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the idea of community wealth building as democratic resistance. So a way in which local communities, people operating democratically at the local level, can try and have some pushback against what might be going on under certain circumstances in terms of national politics. So what is community wealth building? Well, in my book with Joe Guyman, we describe community wealth building as a local economic development strategy focused on building collaborative, inclusive, sustainable, and democratically controlled local economies. So CWD is a strategy for local economies that looks to take a long-run strategic approach in order to create more sustainable, more egalitarian, and more democratic local economic outcomes. So that's an approach that sees a central role for local government in shaping the economy over time, not just thinking of itself as a provider of a set of services just on the basis of providing value for money. So the thought is that if you're a city government, a local government, a regional government, but also if you're an institution with a kind of quasi-public function rooted in a particular place, like a university, then what you ought to be doing is taking a long-run strategic view about the whole range of your economic interactions so as to create more equal and more democratic outcomes. So, the clicker does work now, that's very good. So that obviously is quite a broad set of different possible approaches. And so community wealth building can involve a variety of different means and mechanisms. So the goals can be shared across different times and places, but the specific institutions and policies that are used could be different in different places, depending on local circumstances and on the ideas that emerge in each place. So to give a sense of the range of possibility there, the institutional elements of community wealth building could include things like worker cooperatives, community land trusts, community development financial institutions, anchor procurement strategies. I'll come back to that and explain what I mean by that in a moment. Municipal and local public enterprises, and public and community banking. So what political philosophers often love, if you think about the attention that the idea of universal basic income gets, is they love the one big simple idea that solves everything. This is the opposite of that, right? This is the idea more of a set of coherent goals that ought to be pursued by a range of institutions, and then quite a complicated story about the range of mechanisms that might help you to get there. So if you're a big fan of the one big idea that solves everything, this may not be that attractive an option. So the history of this idea, I guess, is kind of a North Atlantic history. The two countries where this kind of model has emerged is probably the US and the UK. In my home country, the UK, community wealth building has mostly been a strategy pursued by local councils, by boroughs, city governments, and so on. But before that, I guess the emergence of these ideas was really in Cleveland, Ohio, in a sort of deindustrialized, really quite poor city in the American Midwest. And there, the strategy came up, first of all, through the behavior of what we'll call anchor institutions. So those are large place-based institutions that have a long-run attachment to a particular area or a particular locality, and that have a substantial amount of potential power to shape the character and the direction of the local economy. So in England, in Britain, people talk a lot about the so-called Preston model. So this is Preston, again, a deindustrialized city in the north of England that's been the main laboratory for the early development of these ideas. That model really developed from Preston Council trying to think about how the sort of strategy that had been used by local hospitals and universities in Cleveland in order to regenerate their area, how that could be incorporated into the work of a local political authority. And the Cleveland model really was about a way in which those institutions that felt that in many ways they were being failed by local government and that there was nothing going on in order to really create sustained, inclusive growth within their area. We're trying to find a way of bypassing what government, to bypass the failures of government by taking the initiative in terms of driving kind of an egalitarian democratic form of political and of economic area. So the approach in Preston in the UK has combined local government with a number of local anchor institutions. So in that case, the county council, the NHS trust, so that's like the hospital institutions and medical institutions in the area, the constabulary, like the local police force, the local sixth form college, and the local university, all kind of got together and decided to pursue a kind of shared economic development strategy. And therefore, in the UK, community wealth building has more come to be seen as a local government strategy, but the origins of the approach really, in the case of Cleveland, lie much more with it being a strategy for anchor institutions acting kind of around the edge of what government does. So I do quite a lot of work with an organization in the US called the Democracy Collaborative, which are really the organization that I think can take credit for setting up this approach to thinking about economic development. And what I'm going to do really briefly, and this will be the least philosophical bit really of the talk, is just to give you a sense of the kind of plurality of different strategies that get pursued there. I'm just going to run through the democracy collaborative approach to community wealth building. And here I'm drawing on the work of my colleagues Neil McEnroy and Sarah McKinley, who are respectively the Democracy Collaborative's global lead for community wealth building and the director of community wealth building programs there. So, so the Democracy Collaborative talks about a 5-pillar approach to community wealth building. So thinking about fair work, locally rooted finance, just use of land and property, progressive procurement, so how local authorities and anchor institutions spend their money, and inclusive and democratic enterprises. So thinking about social enterprises, cooperatives, and other alternative forms of economic organisation. And the thought is that if you have a very extractive kind of neoliberal economic model, where the money that local authorities or local anchor institutions are spending ends up really just going into the pockets of large multinationals that are often going to be very good at minimizing their tax liabilities, that might be quite bad employers, that might have an awful lot of features that really don't fit with the idea of a more inclusive and democratic economy. The thought is that these 5 kinds of strategies are a way to kind of push a wedge through that model. I've already talked about the idea of an anchor institution, and I will just, these slides are really just here to give a sense of the range of different kinds of policies that you can justify on this kind of approach. So that's the kinds of approaches that fall under the idea of fair work, the idea of trying to go for locally rooted finance, thinking about the just use of land and property, thinking about procurement spending, and then thinking about inclusive democratic forms of enterprise. So that's really just to give you a little bit of a sense of the range of institutional policies that I have in mind there. Now, why is this a talk in political philosophy? I think that might have been a thought that's with some of you already. So here's why I think this is philosophically interesting. So I think methodologically, it's very useful sometimes to start with practice and to go from practice to theory, rather than starting from theory and then talking about application. It can be a lot more revealing to look at real world examples of where people have tried to find ways of dealing with an extractive, undemocratic, unequal economy. What have people done when they've taken that approach seriously? And then how have they thought about how to get around that? And what can that tell us actually about how we could imagine a better kind of economic model? As my co-author, who is not a philosopher, but is someone involved with this very practically, said to me, so, well, look, all of this clearly works in practice, but can we actually make it work in theory as well? Which hopefully we have in our book. But I think it's not just about interpretation either, but it's about trying to have a kind of dialogue between theory and practice. What I've found in kind of doing this sort of work is that when you talk to people who are involved day in, day out with this kind of like approach to economic development, they're very, very eager to talk about the values there, to talk about the conception of justice that they're aiming for. And they're very eager to kind of have those discussions, to think seriously about what actually the normative basis of this kind of work might be. There's no hostility at all to philosophy if the approach from philosophers is one of trying to have a constructive dialogue and not saying, right, I've derived this from the true Kantian theory of economic institutions is this, and this is what you ought to do. If you think of this more as a kind of a dialogue, as itself an egalitarian process, it's, I think, really interesting to see the kind of engagement and the kind of enthusiasm that one gets from actually talking about people who are involved in this in very practical ways. I think then there's a way in which philosophical work on this can help to elucidate and to clarify exactly what it is that's going on with these kinds of approaches. So I think in the early period of community wealth building, its proponents would often talk about repatriating the spend of like a local authority or a university or whatever it was, relocalizing it, getting back in their area. And that opened up, obviously, a line of criticism that said, well, look, this is just a form of localism or protectionism. It's just looking after your own. And actually, this is just going to be economically counterproductive, because if everyone does this, then you're just going to get an outcome, actually, where it's just a kind of beggar my neighbor process. But I think when you dig down into the normative basis of this kind of approach, it turns out that the localism is really instrumental for other kinds of desiderata. It's a way of accessing other kinds of valuable features that you're trying to aim for in economic development. So it's not an end in itself to spend locally per se, but that often local spending will be a proxy for other kinds of goods or values that you're going after. So think of the difference between if you're a university and all your catering is outsourced to Starbucks or to whoever it might be, as against a university that looks to work with local co-ops or local social enterprises or whatever it might be. What would drive the choice to do that will be some issues around sustainability, around job quality, about distributive outcomes, not the mere concern with localism per se, but localism as a way of achieving those other sorts of goods. It's also, I think, for philosophers, I think it's been a besetting problem of analytic political philosophy that we've often been writing about what states ought to do, as if we're somehow able to write work that just would be inputted into the minds of some sort of imagined benevolent philosopher king or philosopher queen, not thinking really that carefully about the different levels and points of governance within an economy, and not actually kind of reflexively thinking about our own role as citizens, kind of offering thoughts in a philosophical idiom that might themselves feed into a broader set of political discussions. So a centralist approach that only thinks about, the state in this very abstract way of state power in terms of a kind of centralist model loses sight of the way at which power gets exercised at lots of different points. And it can be, at the same time, it's a lot easier to try and influence change if philosophically you're thinking about the basis of justification for different kinds of economic policies at a level, whether that's in a city or a regional level. And of course, it will be an internal recommendation of many views in political philosophy that there's something valuable in exercising in the exercise of power being less concentrated and more dispersed within society. Now, I was talking yesterday to Claudio, and I realized that in Chile, ideas of subsidiarity have a very particular and a very particular set of associations. So, which are probably different, I think, to the way that subsidiarity comes up in Catholic political thinking, and we are, after all, giving this talk underneath the cross. But I take it that in the Catholic model, that's a very different thought. But again, in the idea that there's something lost in terms of, the kind of relational egalitarian idea that actually what we care about in distributed terms is not only a distribution of access to goods, but also a distribution of power, and the thought that a very centralized distribution of power is going to be one that people will have good reasons to complain about. So I'm eager to learn more about Chilean thinking on these issues, and I realize your own political context is different to my one, but maybe that's something that could come up in the discussion. So I think, in a way, thinking about this, it's a form of non-ideal theory. Philosophers have recently turned, I think political philosophers have recently turned to trying to think more about non-ideal theory, but philosophers being philosophers, a lot of the outcome of this is people writing endless papers about 5 ways of making the distinction between ideal and non-ideal, or what even is it for something to be. But this is just trying to think about what it actually is to do it. Important as well, I think, to think about transition. So if you go back to the democracy collaborative model, the thought here is that this is a transitional strategy, right? That this is about trying to pursue a number of different kinds of approaches that, taken together, might have an effect of destabilizing a current economic model. So this is also an idea about economic and political transition. And intriguingly, I think we find lots, a number of political philosophers have been quite involved in this in a very practical way. Another co-author, Tad Williamson, spent 2 years running the Office of Community Wealth Building in Richmond, Virginia, where he just took a 2-year sabbatical from his work to do that. And Fab's work has been deeply informed by that kind of practical political experience. The last time I gave a talk in Chile, so I think Chile is somewhere where actually academics do seem to have a kind of come in and out of politics a lot. I gave a talk a number of years ago in Valparaiso, and I realized that my 2 commentators on that occasion are now the Chilean ambassador to the OECD and the Minister for Energy. So this is definitely a society in which there's more, where there's a tradition of movement between academic debates and thinking about practical politics. So the more philosophical part, what is the core values-based justification of this kind of approach? Well, the core argument of our book is that plurality of strategies, and I gestured at the complexity of the idea here and the range of different kinds of policies that can fall under this. This is all about leveraging existing institutional power to create more egalitarian and more democratic local economies. So part of the argument of the book with Joe Guyman is that those 2 goals, the egalitarian goal and the democratic goal, have a kind of close mutual relation with one another. So on the one hand, this is really the kind of core normative argument of our book. The thought is that more democratic societies are more able to realize political values, like the value of social equality, in institutional terms, instead of being hidebound by a market-based or transactional approach to thinking about institutions and policies. If you see local government as just an institution that provides a number of services at the best possible kind of value for money price, and don't think really of the full degree of sort of political power that an institution like that has. If you think of it primarily as just a service deliverer rather than a site for the exercise of democratic power, then that institution or that set of institutions will have less capacity to realize particular values in what it does. And that's going to be the same if you think about the kind of broader strategy of other kinds of large public and quasi-public institutions. So that's kind of one direction of the argument. The other direction of the argument says that more egalitarian societies will, on the whole, kind of be able to realize a more collaborative, open, vibrant, democratic culture. And hence, they're going to be better at solving collective problems and at guaranteeing the status and dignity of all their citizens. So the thought is that just as you're more able to pursue egalitarian outcomes under conditions when you think more imaginatively about the democratic power of different institutions, So too, the kind of outcome of having, a more equal and more democratic economic sphere is part of the kind of background there to thinking about the preconditions for a more flourishing democratic culture. So that really, I suppose, is, we're pointing there towards quite a familiar line of argument in the history of political philosophy that's there in John Stuart Mill or in Carol Pateman's work in Participation. And the thought being that if you think about the democratic sphere as just being about elections, if you think of it as being hived off from the rest of economic life, then you're going to create a very attenuated democratic culture that's not actually going to create the kind of preconditions for genuinely working through kind of values and policies in a collective and constructive way. So this approach in philosophical terms, I think, has got a number of different kinds of connections to particular different sorts of histories in philosophical thinking and in kind of practical politics. So I think it absolutely fits with the kind of the rejection of, if you like, recipient-oriented ways of thinking about distributive justice, of the kind that have been critiqued by Iris Marion Young or by Rainer Forst, where they've argued for a more kind of emancipatory conception of what it is to care about social justice. Not that you're just trying to create a particular kind of distribution for people, but that thinking seriously about social justice is rather about trying to create the social conditions actually for the kind of active engagement of people as citizens and as equals with one another. It's also, I think, in terms of various kinds of European traditions, I'd be very interested to know if there are perhaps Chilean connections here as well. I think it's about, in part, recovering an older tradition of municipal socialism. So, I mean, some of the exemplars that advocates of community wealth building point to include, some of the various kind of socialist administrations you had in US Midwestern cities in the early 20th century, thinking about the kind of city government that you had in Vienna in the interwar period, thinking as well about in my own country, there's a very interesting history of a kind of radical local government in London, in particular, both in the kind of pre-Second World War era and then in the 70s and 80s until Mrs. Thatcher was so unimpressed by the egalitarian radical democratic politics of the Greater London Council that she abolished that entire level of government in London. London had no citywide government between the mid-80s and the very early 2000s. There were also connections, I think, to the sort of the kind of James Mead-inspired versions of liberal democratic socialism that are quite influential, I think, on Rawls's thinking when Rawls talks about the institutional realization of his principles of justice. And I think it also fits in quite carefully. I'll be talking more about Mead and about Piketty this afternoon at the Universidad de Chile in the law department. So if anyone wants to hear more about those, you can come along to that later on. But I think there's three ways then of thinking about this sort of approach. So the dreaded word that I'm told has bad valences in Chile, there's certainly an idea there of subsidiarity and local integration in the pursuit of social justice. The idea that local community wealth building strategies can be integrated with state level policies for delivering more just outcomes. And in fact, it can be an important aspect of overall political strategies to deliver social justice if you think about, as it were, a kind of coherence model that says that part of what it might be to have a more egalitarian economic settlement might be to devolve somehow to kind of lower and more local units. But a diametrically different view to that, and really this is how these ideas have been practiced, I think, mostly in the last, let's say 15 years in my own country, where we've had a national government that's really been quite hostile to more egalitarian economic outcomes, it's been seen more as a form of democratic resistance under non-ideal circumstances. So there we have something much more like the opposite case, where central government is acting really against creating more egalitarian outcomes, but where strategies like community wealth building allow local government and local anchor institutions to use the power that they already have in order to pursue more egalitarian and more democratic outcomes. And really, whether one has, as it were, that kind of coherence model or that kind of more resistance model, with both of them, I think there's a kind of case where one should just think about the significance of like laboratories of experimentation in democratic politics. So if you have a system where actually you're allowing a genuine plurality of different kinds of approaches to be pursued at the level of particular city governments, or if you think about, you know, my original home city of London, which has 32 local, like borough level authorities within that area. If you have a kind of pluralism there as regards to the kinds of means and the kinds of strategies that are being pursued there, what you have is a very practical set of experiments there for finding out what kinds of ideas actually can function well. And that's just also just a way actually of trying to have a more dynamic democratic system that actually learns how to solve problems, how to evolve, that creates more sort of information for democratic citizens over time. And that could be true, you know, both with a kind of coherence model or with a resistance model of this kind of approach. So I realise we've not got a huge amount of time. So I think just going to skip a little bit through some of what I have to say there about that kind of type 2 strategy of democratic resistance, because I'm quite eager to make use of this time really for more of a discussion. But I will just sort of being a bit of a Rawlsian, I can't resist trying to tie this a little bit back to Rawls. So I'll just talk a little bit about this slide, and then I think I'll wrap things up and we can discuss them. So it seems to me, certainly if I think about my own political society, if I think about the UK, there's often a kind of sense of sort of democratic powerlessness or hopelessness, where that can be both a symptom of living under quite an unjust society, and of course then a cause of it as well, because you have a sense that there can be a kind of lack of confidence in democratic agency. It was really interesting to see the, well, although, I mean, I always seem to come to Chile when there's an election in Britain. I mean, we're in election time at the moment, and it looks like, you know, the Labour Party are going to replace the Conservative Party in the UK. But the last British election in 2019, where Boris Johnson's Conservatives beat Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, there seemed to be a really interesting phenomenon whereby the more ambitious Labour's pledges were for the kind of change that they were going to bring about, the more scepticism that generated, the more hostility that seemed to bring up, because there was almost a sense of kind of just a sense that things couldn't radically change, and that anyone that was promising that was just kind of clearly not to be trusted. And I think in part that's sort of, it's a kind of understandable response to periods of kind of failing institutions. And I think given that, it's important to think about what the possibilities are for giving citizens a sense of the malleability of institutions and conditions and the possibility of shared agency. And it's very hard to do that if your focus is just thinking about national politics rather than thinking about kind of other levels at which people can exercise power collectively. So that connects, I think, with the Rawlsian idea of the social basis of self-respect. As Rawls puts it, those aspects of basic institutions normally essential if citizens are to have a lively sense of their worth as persons and to have the confidence and the ability to advance their ends with self-confidence. So you can think there that there's a kind of democratic, I'm just going to move this window so that this is visible on the, yeah, there we go. You can think that there's a kind of democratic analogue of that Rawlsian idea, an idea of sort of democratic self-respect. So quasi-public institutions such as universities then can have a role in pushing back against that sense of fatalism or powerlessness that can be so inimical to kind of well-functioning political.
So maybe the first line, the left line.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You put in this.
I'll put that down there for now. Oh, does that work? No. Yeah. So, oh, now I have to try and remember what I've said there. So very often, universities, well, I don't know if this is true in Chile, but in the UK, universities will talk about their contribution to local GDP. They'll talk about, what they're adding to the economy, but they won't maybe talk as much as they could do about what they're doing in terms of helping to generate a sense of democratic agency or democratic possibility. So under really non-ideal conditions, we need our shared institutions to step up in terms of their broader social and political role. And that picture of the role of anchor institutions in community world building, I think, gives a sense of what might be possible. So, gracias por escuchar, and I'll look for that's terrible pronunciation, but I look forward to our discussion. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Martin. Bueno, tenemos un tiempo para preguntas de parte. ¿Sí? Voy a estar también recibiendo otras preguntas por chat de las personas que están conectadas remotamente. Así que, pero parto por acá. ¿Quiere partir con alguna pregunta? Voy a tratar de hacer o traducir si quieren, si no pueden preguntar directamente a Martín y si no hago la traducción.
Quería preguntar, podría ahondar en el concepto de ancla y de institución, ¿no? ¿Cómo puede ser ese rol de figura simbólica en ancla con las instituciones dentro del concepto global de la riqueza comunitaria? Si pudiera ahondar un poquito más en ese concepto.
People can go deeper in the idea of anchor institution, but particularly the idea of anchor with the complete model of
Yeah, so the idea there is just that if you think about the range of potentially transformative institutions within a particular city or a particular region or whatever it might be, it will often turn out that there's going to be a number of institutions there that aren't just market actors. So that aren't just firms that are there only for, let's say, for profit-based reasons, but that, like a university, like, particular foundations that are connected to a particular area, like other kinds of kind of public or partially public institutions. Many of us are going to find that we've got connections to or are involved with institutions that, on the one hand, often spend a lot of money, employ people, have like a physical footprint, have control over land and over public space, that are large employers, that are large purchasers of services. And I think the idea then is that if one thinks about these so-called anchor institutions, that those sorts of institutions, it turns out, have got this interesting kind of double set of features, that it turns out that if some of that kind of local power is used deliberately and consciously, rather than that institution just thinking of itself as, so let's say when it's doing its So, I mean, what's a good example here? If you think of like a university thinking about its cleaning services, does it just say, right, can we outsource that and do that as cheaply as possible? Because our goal, after all, is just, you know, we're providing education for our students, and if we can cut our budget on cleaning, that's great. And we don't think about, you know, the employment conditions there. We don't think about whether those are unionized jobs. We don't think about, you know, the voice of those workers within the institution. Maybe the cheapest thing to do is just to outsource that to a servicing company. But if, on the other hand, you have that kind of change of view that says, well, okay, we've got a lot of power here, and we've also got a kind of long-run vision of what it might be to contribute towards the public good here. Well, maybe it's very important that people in maybe these kind of less prestigious jobs are fully members of our community. Maybe they have the opportunity to be unionized. Maybe we make sure that their terms and conditions are very good. Maybe, you know, maybe that's going to mean actually that our costs are going to go up a little bit there, but that might be something that would be worth doing deliberately if you come to think of the institution as having a kind of long-run strategic interest in the kind of the quality of the public sphere and the relations between people within the local economy. So the symbolic idea there, I guess, of an anchor is that if you think of these institutions just simply as market participants with very narrow interests, then you have, as it were, just an economy that's just going to, under market pressures, go in whatever way. It's not going to be grounded in a particular set of values. Whereas if institutions like that are able to say, no, we've got clear views here on what the values that we take seriously are, and to actually sort of act as something that then sort of anchors that local economy, that gives it a kind of basis that fixes it in a commitment to a particular set of values, then the thought is those sorts of institutions can transform what their role is into this kind of much broader understanding of what it is to contribute to the public sphere within a particular place. I hope that helps. Thank you.
I have another question tengo otra pregunta de Leonardo Cofré. Voy a leerla. Hi Martin, thanks for this. Leonardo Cofré here. I have a question regarding counter arguments about localism. You highlighted the bright side of localism. But it's also conceived of a place where a lot of biases appear. Tribalism, conservatism, clientelism. How the CWB project may deal with these biases?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very, I don't know who to talk to, but it's on Zoom. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think in some ways that's, I think the answer to that looks very different. I think whether one's taking that kind of the sort of integrated coherence kind of approach as against seeing community wealth building as a form of pushback against sort of central government policy. So I think if what one's thinking about as having a framework for community wealth building that's embedded within a broader set of policies that, let's say, a national government develops, then what you can, of course, do there is look to have procedures in place for kind of checking on, you know, how it is that, you know, that local authorities, for example, actually are kind of pursuing a clearly, you know, an agenda that's clearly in the public interest as conceived within a particular kind of conception of what that is, rather than just using their sort of discretion as a form of clientelism or looking after their, you know, their sort of favourite people or whoever it might be. Now, some of that can just really sort of be done through the kind of standard forms of oversight and audit that you get with any kind of public policy. But what that means is that if you, let's say, if you think about the procurement of a local authority, do you write the kind of call for tenders there that just talks about value for money, or do you talk about making sure that there's employee voice? Do you talk about like the quality of jobs that are going to get created, the kind of investment that goes into skills there, the importance of unionization, etc., etc. So there are ways, I think, of building into like formal forms of public procurement that, like anything else, then are open to oversight and audit. Just a broader set of social values rather than just thinking of those as kind of purely economic transactions. But I mean, I think at the same time, it's important to acknowledge the risk that that when you give more discretion to people, when you actually think that it's important that there's more conscious pursuit of particular kinds of values in the exercise of decision making, whether at the level of local authorities or at the level of institutions like universities, that does carry a risk that does, because it pulls some power down to a more local level. That means there are more points at which power could come to get abused. But as it were, that's a perennial problem of democracy. And I think one has to think that you know, a good response to that is just to ensure there's openness, ensure that to show that there's kind of good information there, that there are venues for contestation and public debate, because you can't, I think, close off the possibility of democratic agency just because it could, under some circumstances, lead to bad outcomes. Because the alternative to that is not, as it were, some unproblematic magical alternative that gets rid of those problems. It's just often to push forms of bureaucratic discretion up into sort of positions in more centralized hierarchies where a lot of those same problems are there, and often the forms of contestation might be even harder. So I'm very sympathetic with the worry that, as Rawls says at one point, we should compare, you know, like with like. It should be the real world version of the system we endorse as against the real world version of the current system. Or we can compare ideals with ideals. What we mustn't do is compare one ideal with another reality. But I think as long as we're quite clear-eyed about doing that, then I think really those are the kinds of problems that are just pervasive problems that, you know, whether it's more democratic or more bureaucratic forms of decision making.
Question. So at the beginning, thank you very much for the talk. At the beginning of the talk, you made a theoretical distinction between UBI and this view. So I understood that UBI was like one big idea, whereas this had many implications. But do you see this as something that would be exclusionary to UBI, or do you think that they can coexist?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit more about UBI this afternoon at the other university if anyone wants to. I don't think they're exclusionary. So I was just poking fun a little bit at UBI there, in that it's striking, I think, how often sometimes almost contradictory arguments are made for this one very simple policy, where the attraction of it often seems to be the very simplicity of the policy, and where I guess there's a big difference between two different ways in which people argue for UBI. So I think there's one maybe maximalist view that really wants to say that is so this is maybe more the view of Philippe Van Parijs's early work of Real Freedom for All, his book from the late 90s, where the thought really is that's overwhelmingly the kind of the most powerful approach that we have in public policy, and that very often that's, you know, that we should look for the UBI to be at the highest possible level, and where you know, a very general argument about a particular conception of freedom drives that as really the kind of centerpiece of a different economic system. So there's that kind of view, as against a view that's much more, you know, rather than maximalist, that's pluralist, and that says, well, look, a UBI at some kind of level might be a justifiable part of a broader set of institutions designed to bring about a more just settlement. I think I wouldn't necessarily have much of an argument against proponents of that. You know, in fact, I think I could be very sympathetic to proponents of that second version of UBI, and I don't think there's anything exclusionary at the level of political implementation between, on the one hand, thinking about the sort of suite of policies associated with community world building, and then thinking about UBI. It was much more there as a sort of admission that while sometimes it can seem philosophically attractive to have theoretically very simple solutions to empirically very difficult and complex problems of injustice, what this approach is really, it's a kind of an umbrella for a range, a kind of an experimental range of different kinds of attempts united by a kind of common aim that doesn't have the kind of very attractive theoretical simplicity of UBI, but I think, you know, things should be as simple as they can be, but they shouldn't be more simple than that. I think having that complexity, given the complexity of some of the forms of injustice that one might be looking to address, I think that's just the cost of trying to be responsive to the world as it is. But I fully acknowledge that means that the view doesn't have that kind of, the great kind of theoretical attractiveness of let's say, the maximalist version of UBI. Although, in fairness to Philippe Van Parijs, of course, he no longer, I think, advocates the maximalist version. He's much more of a pluralist. Well, yeah, so the basic income book from 4 or 5 years ago with Yannick van der Blot is much more pluralist. It's much more sort of maximalist view, I think. Thank you.
I think when you talk about this realism, when you talk about an alternative, people say, well, you're an idealist. And it happens to be that people have lost their capacity to dream alternatives. And I 100% agree with the theory, but I think there is a practical problem there about how you deal with that social lack of what's your learning lots of hope.
And I mean, it's interesting that can feel like a familiar thought here in Chile as well, because I think that feels like a very pervasive phenomenon in my home country. I think that there's a sort of a lack of democratic confidence and a lack of thought that things really can be better. So I mean, in some ways, I mean, I mentioned Preston in the north of England. That's been a really interesting example. I mean, for better and for worse, I think, in ways of this kind of approach, in that if you look at a lot of, I mean, the external indicators, so, you know, some of the big, I forget, one of the big sort of London consulting firms has like an index of, you know, how well each town is doing, and, you know, Preston's performing really like amazingly well on all these kind of external measures of, you know, sort of job quality and all these kind of quality of life measures and stuff. So there's definitely been a real kind of improvement here. There's been work published in public health, looking at public health, like mental health outcomes. Seems to have been like a real uptick over the kind of 10 or more years that this approach has been followed there. So there's a sense there in which, like, this can't but be very real and applied, because this is embedded in actual practice, in things that are being done to different degrees in different places already, and where often there have been really remarkable outcomes. But at the same time, I think it is a bit double-edged. The story really in Preston has been, I think, some incredibly visionary and enthusiastic and relentlessly hardworking local councillors, including the council leader, Matthew Brown, who've really got a vision and have sort of stuck with it. But I'm not sure it's really the case yet, even, you know, more than a decade in, that thinking has really sort of pervaded into sort of, you know, day-to-day political discourse in the area. Because obviously, you know, the experience of lots of those sorts of communities in parts of England outside of London, you know, was really a kind of, has been a story often of generational decline, you know, and the places that had very, very kind of thriving economies 40 years ago, you know, then kind of going through a very badly handled process of deindustrialization, and, you know, often still a sense that there isn't really, you know, the kind of economic basis for a kind of very hopeful attitude towards the future there. So I think that, I mean, it was, this was an approach that was very much, I think, well, it was very much kind of in kind of being supported by the British Labour Party under the previous leadership, not so much now. But I think some of the thinking around the sort of the period where these ideas were quite sort of being pushed at the level of the kind of national political, the National Labour Party in the UK was exactly that thought that part of what it is to kind of open up a sense of democratic possibility is that you have to offer some very tangible changes first. That first of all, you have to be able to say, oh wow, like there's much better public space in our city now, or, you know, there's actually, look, I know someone who's working in a co-op that's thriving, or I know someone who's you know, who's been able to kind of get public contracts for their, you know, their small local business that's doing really well, and that, yeah, and you need to kind of build up these stories before people actually then get the sense of, oh yeah, actually we're not just being buffeted here by sort of external economic forces that we have no control over, but actually it turns out that the institutions that we're connected to and voting for are actually changing what it's like. So I think it's I think it just has to be a very slow and gradual process. And I think, yeah, it's just really double-edged, the way that even where there's been tangible, measurable kind of progress in terms of indicators and outcomes, it's really hard to really kind of shift that sense of democratic possibility when that sense of democratic possibility has maybe been eroded for 40 years. So it's a great question, and there's not an easy answer. But yeah,
but history helps a lot. And
yeah,
one has to research about successful histories, like Spain, or Royal,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I didn't mention that was a huge, if you go to Preston, one of the things that they're most influenced by, like a lot of the councillors that are involved in this have been over to Mondragon in the Basque Country, you know, they've spent time there, they've engaged with the folk there. And I think, you know, that gave them a kind of sense of, oh, this is possible, right? That in, you know, and in some ways, you know, places that have a lot of similarities in terms of, you know, the kind of like the shift in like the composition of the economy, like moves away from, you know, manufacturing and so on. But nevertheless, there you have much more conscious direction of the local economies through, you know, through the agency of a set of cooperatives. So I think, yeah, that's been a huge influence there. And I think it's really interesting actually that, I mean, it's a kind of nice side of globalization there. You know, I suppose it's easy to lose track of like, even, within one country of like the historical examples that there often are of like when you look at like, the history of the United States, let's say, of like socialist city administrations in various parts of the Midwest in the 1920s. This stuff all gets very forgotten. But actually, the thought that there's not only, sort of particular histories, but there's a kind of global set of examples of different ways of doing things, ways of having more democratic economic settlements. And, it doesn't have to just be at the level of kind of pure abstraction, but, there are practical examples that people can point to and can learn from. So, yeah, I'm agreeing completely.
I think that we're going to take the last words. I have a question, Martin. You mentioned the relevance of the model for transitional processes. Right? I think I'm not sure if you are taking those words from the literature in climate change science.
Yeah.
That there is a part of that discussion, the global discussion about climate crisis. There has to be with how we can transition from now to a decarbonized society. No, and the problem there, or the discussion there, is how this transitional adaptation is just. Right, I mean, that is the discussion. So my question is, how do you think the CWB model can handle that? Can in terms of sustainability? I'm representative of the development institute now. So my question is in that area.
Yeah, so I think often a concern with sustainability has been really close to what's driving this in a lot of areas. And in fact, if you look at some of the examples of community wealth building, I mean, for example, there's a very admirable community wealth building council in North Ayrshire in Scotland, just to the southwest of Glasgow. One thing they were really pushing there was trying to develop more like community-owned green power initiative, right? So trying to look at wind and solar, trying to develop that with community ownership in a way that you could have a kind of long-term time horizon there and not be reliant on kind of private financing for the energy transition there. So I think absolutely this is a way in which I suppose, especially if a local area, if a city or a region or a set of anchor institutions are really conscious of a sense of frustration that the decarbonisation transition isn't going quick enough, that maybe what's happening at the level of their national government is just sort of deeply disappointing, and they want to kind of think about how they can sort of shift towards a more sort of sustainable model. Then I think this framework gives you exactly a way of thinking about how you can sort of practically start to do that, and how there's such a gap, as it were, between the choices you can make as one consumer, or then just someone voting in the national election. But as a member of as someone with voice in a kind of in a local community, or as a member of a university, or whatever it might be, there's suddenly a lot more leverage there to think about. Okay, well, are there sort of community-owned kind of green technologies that we could be pushing here? What can we do with the power that we have there to kind of shift things more towards sustainable outcomes? So I think that in a way, in general, this can be seen as a kind of a transitionary strategy of just kind of using whatever power you have at whatever level is available, where that kind of the waiting on national governments is often going to be a source of frustration disappointment. So I think it's striking and unsurprising that very often what you've seen where community wealth building has sort of really been pushed forward is exactly the kind of shift towards kind of more sustainable sets of economic policies, and especially thinking about the way in which a community might come to have like more of a long run stake in green technologies around sort of energy generation and so on. So I think it fits very well in that.
Gracias a todos por venir. Yo creo que nos vamos a Martín para terminar.